Good morning. We're going to be in Daniel this morning again in chapter 3. And last week we looked at and introduced to Daniel and his three friends. We're going to focus mostly this morning on those three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What we looked at last week being the light on the hill, the city set on the hill, the lamp in the house that gives light, not shining our light, but letting our light shine so that others may see the good works and give glory to our Father in heaven. We're going to continue that narrative a little bit more this morning. And as I was sitting here looking over it very briefly, I think we're going to do one more lesson in addition to the one that we had planned with Daniel in the Lion's Den. And next week, I think we're going to spend some time on Nebuchadnezzar. He needs some time here. He is a major player in these first 4 chapters in the book of Daniel. And I think there is a lot that we can learn from this man who wasn't of the people of Israel. He wasn't from the tribe of Judah. He was a foreigner to those people. He was their captor and didn't know the Word of God. And yet we see him develop over the course of these 4 chapters that I think that we can take quite a bit from. We're going to look this morning, though, at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I want to ask you a couple questions, though. First, as we look at this scene, these 3 young Jewish men who have been captured and carried off to this foreign land find themselves faced with a decision to make. A decision that when you sort of break it down and you think, well, what was the big deal? They're asked to bow down and worship this idol, this thing they know isn't real, or face death. Can you bow to an idol and not worship it? Do you have to physically bow to an idol in order to worship it? Now, those are 2 different ideas there. One, it kind of lets you off the hook a little bit. Well, I can bow to this thing, but I'm not really worshiping it. Or rather, maybe more prominent or important for our discussion today, in our society where we don't have golden images set up before us and people go and physically bow down and worship it, can you worship an idol without actually doing that? The aspects of worship and what that entails is a different subject. That's something to be thinking about as we approach this scene here, these 3 Jewish men who have to make a tough decision. The easy way or the right way. Have you ever been faced with that kind of a decision? A decision that it's easy to make the wrong decision. It's easy to justify the wrong decision. To think, it's not really that big of a deal. I'll just do this. Nobody will know. I'm not really doing this. It's just sort of for the show of it. An example of this would be found maybe in the first century Christians as they're facing persecution. And the Roman Empire is basically submitted these seals, these coins, that you had to have in order to be able to buy and sell in the community. And by getting that coin, you basically indicated that you believe that Caesar is a god, the god that you're going to worship. Well, it's not real. He's not really God. They don't really expect me to believe this. They just really want me to sign on the dotted line, as it were. And let's just pretend that you believe this and that I believe that you believe this, and we'll just go on. You can keep doing everything that you're doing, but you still need this coin and say that you believe that Caesar is God. And we think, well, what's the big deal? If you don't really believe it, and they don't think that you really believe it. And Nebuchadnezzar is asking these men to bow down and worship this golden idol. I don't know the timeline of this. I mentioned last week that the timeline of Daniel is kind of weird. We're not really sure exactly how much time has passed from chapter 2 to chapter 3. We don't know if this happened around the same time or if it was years in the future or maybe even a little bit before the scenes in chapter 1 and 2. But we know that that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are known to the king, are known to his people who are in charge of tattletaling, as it were. Because the king sets up this golden idol. And if you think back to last week's lesson in chapter 2, the king has this dream about this idol. It's made up of this different kind of stuff, and the head was gold, and then iron and a couple other things, bronze and clay feet with iron mixed into it. And Daniel interprets this dream and tells the king, you're the gold head. This is just your kingdom. So it kind of makes sense, it kind of flows to think that maybe this king Nebuchadnezzar, who at the end of chapter 2, one of the great successes, one of the great victories for Daniel and his friends was that they had gotten this foreigner, this foreign ruler who is very steeped in idol worship, to recognize that God is the God of heaven. What a great thing. That was the whole point of what Daniel was doing. He might not have consciously made that decision of, I'm going to keep myself pure. But that was the end result. God was given the glory. And so it seems to me that it would have stroked Nebuchadnezzar's ego to set up a golden image to be worshipped. And so they had all these kind of instruments that played. And Nebuchadnezzar said, at this time, you bow down and you worship this idol as God, or you will be thrown into a furnace. Tough decision. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't do it. And these wise men, the king's counselors, go in verse 8. Certain of the Chaldeans maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made this decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever doesn't fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. There are certain Jews, in verse 12, whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon. So we know that it's after what happened in chapter 2. Because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were promoted to be in charge of this province in Babylon. These men pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. These guys are malicious. They are persecuting Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The Bible tells us they were malicious, but then the language that they use. They don't pay any attention to you, king. That's not true. It's not true. It's true in that they didn't worship this idol. But they're going a step further and making the assumption, making the claim to rile up the king, and he certainly gets riled up here. He's mad. And he calls these guys in and says, hey, what's the deal? I told you, you've got to bow down to this idol or you're going to be thrown in the furnace. And almost you can see in my mind's eye, the king looking at these three guys knowing they're good men. He appointed them into this position because they were good men. And almost like he takes this deep breath. And, all right, we'll get one more shot here. You go and you hear this music. Everybody else is doing it. Just bow down and we'll all be okay. Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. Let's stop right there for a second. Ask yourself, why wouldn't they need to respond to the king in this scene? Why wouldn't they need to tell the king, well, look, we can't do that because our God tells us we can have no other God before him. We can't bow down to any other idol. We can't worship anything else as God except the God of heaven. Why didn't they have to explain that to him other than maybe that he knew that? He knew that because he knew who these guys were personally. He knew who Daniel was personally. And he knew that they wouldn't do it. Maybe he was kind of giving them an out. This is Andy speculating here. don't know this. This isn't what's in the scripture. But it's almost as if the king is saying, look, can you just stand in the back and be cool? Can you just stand back there and when the music plays, you just bow down a little bit and everybody will be happy, and these other guys over here, they're not going to come and complain to me that you're disobeying me. Can you just give a little? Would it have been wrong for them to do that? Would it have been wrong for them to just stand in the back and just look like everybody else, knowing full well that they're not really worshiping this golden idol? Well, from their response, it's clear that they had a problem with that. They would have a problem just sort of looking like everybody else. We're not going to look like we're worshiping a false god. We don't want other people to think that we're worshiping a false god. Verse 17, if this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. I don't know that the reading this and really the way I read it really sets the scene the way it I think played out. These words are not real soft words. They're not trying to soothe the king's anger. If anything, they're kind of poking the fire, poking the bear, upsetting him even more. We don't need to answer you. You know where we stand on this. And we're not going to bow down. Our God will save us. But even if he doesn't, can you imagine saying that to somebody that has the power over life over you? That they have the power to throw you in a thing that was made to smoke metal, to melt down metal. It's that hot. That's what they're going to be thrown into. He can do this, and you're going to sit here and say, even if our God doesn't, it doesn't matter. We're not going to bow down anyway. We see that they have already set the precedent for what they are going to do and what they're not going to do. They are not going to defile themselves with the king's delicacies. We looked at that last week. They are not going to look like everybody else. Just because everybody else is doing this, that's not reason for us to do it. We are going to worship God and him alone. And we're not going to be afraid to do that. This was the decision that they made before they ever were faced with the problem. This was something that they had decided to do before the king ever made the golden image. They made this decision back when they got together with Daniel and decided we're not going to eat the king's delicacies. We're not going to partake in defiling ourselves. And that was a small thing. That was a small thing. You think about the 10 Commandments, and all of the commandments we could break down into a couple of different categories. 2, Jesus makes it. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and treat your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. But we don't see any of the food restrictions in the 10 Commandments. We see you will have no other God before me. And so when you think about if you want to break it down to big commandments and little commandments, they were keeping the little stuff. If we're going to keep the little stuff, we better keep the big stuff. If we're not going to take part in the king's nice food that's unclean for us as Jews, we're not going to bow down and worship a false god. They made the decision long before they got to this point. This kind of reminds me, Acts chapter 4, verse 19 and 20, as Peter and John are standing there before trial, and they're basically being told by the Jews, by Pharisees, not to preach the name of Jesus anymore. And they say, look, if you want us to stop talking about Jesus, if that's right, you're going to have to figure that out for yourself. But we can't help but speak the things that we have seen and know to be true. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego basically said, look, we can't help but only worship God because we know him to be all-powerful. I don't know that we can really say that we have faced the same kind of persecution that these guys have faced, where they are faced with death, a nasty kind of death too, burned alive, or just worship a false god. How many of us would make this little speech here to the person who has that power over us? Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury. And it says there in verse 19 that the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them in the burning furnace. And so they bound them in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown in the burning furnace. I like the little details in there. I like the detail of how his face changed. Almost as if he was hoping, expecting them to just sort of go along. And when they said this, you almost see in his face the anger. Did you dare to go against me? And in his fury, he orders that this furnace be heated up 7 times hotter than it normally is. So hot. This was kind of the foolish behavior of somebody in anger. But as these mighty men in his army go to throw him in, they're killed because it was so hot when they got close enough to chuck him in. Now, I like the little detail. I mean, I don't know that I would have pictured this any other way, but the Bible tells us that they were thrown in wearing everything they had. They were tied up and thrown in wearing all their clothes, their coat and everything. Can you imagine what must have been going through their head? How easy it would have been to just say, whoa, okay, yeah, this is getting real. Let me go. I'll do what you want me to, please. Let's not, I was a moment of insanity here. I'll bow down. I'll do what you want me to. I mean, that would have been almost a knee-jerk reaction. And yet they're thrown in wearing everything they have. And something happens. They fell bound into the burning furnace. And there's verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. And he declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said, "True, O king." And he says in verse 25, "But I see 4 men bound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt." And the presence of the 4th is like the Son of the gods. I believe that this would be the Son of God, who is going to be born of Mary, named Jesus. There, the 4th person in this fiery inferno with 3 men who stood up for what was right even when there was an easy option out. And the king here says, "Whoa, who is that?" And so he calls to him to come out. And then notice the little detail at the end of verse 27. The hair of their head wasn't singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and they didn't even smell like they were been around a campfire, let alone inside of a furnace. They didn't smell smoky. They looked fine. What a scene. What a scene when they came out of this furnace. And what was going on inside there? That's kind of a sidebar here, but hey, what was going on? What were they talking about? And so, notice how the king responds in verse 28. "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any other god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. And then they were promoted as well. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego made a tough decision. A tough decision that, in that they were faced with certain death. And I think, just jumping ahead a little bit to next week, I think that this decision, though, would be easier than some of the tough decisions that we have to make. Because, you see, they didn't have to live in persecution. They didn't have to live in the fire. Sometimes we're faced with a decision that we know is right, and there's an easier way. There's a way that we could get out of this and not even look like we're abandoning our belief. We can get out of it and not even really look like to everybody else, and even can convince ourselves that I'm still a faithful Christian. And yet we know there's a right way and a wrong way. And yet we still have to live in the fire. It's not a one-day decision and then we're thrown into a furnace and then we go and we live in paradise until Jesus comes. Sometimes that can be harder, though. Living the life. Living the right way when sometimes it seems like the wrong way is so much easier. And yet, look at the result of what happened. Nebuchadnezzar sends out this decree through all the land. Nobody better say a single thing bad about the God of heaven, the God of Israel, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because no other God can save like this. They put aside my command so they would not disobey the God of heaven. And in chapter 4, he said to all the people, peoples, nations, languages that dwelt on the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It seems good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. Nebuchadnezzar has a relapse. Chapter 4 goes on, and he has a relapse because of his pride. We'll see next week. Would Nebuchadnezzar have ever gotten to this point? Would Nebuchadnezzar have ever sent something like this out to say that God is the God? He is the Most High God. If it hadn't been for small decisions, small little acts of faithfulness, obedience to God, for Daniel to say, we're not going to defile ourselves. For Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to say, look, we know that you have the power over life or death over us. It doesn't matter if God is going to save us. We know he's got the power to. We know that if we disobey you and you throw us in there, that he can save us. Even if he doesn't, we're not going to do what you want us to. King recognized their acts of faith and obedience and praised God for it, because they let their light shine so that others could see and give God the glory. It's not about us doing what's right because we want to be right. That's important. We need to make sure that ourselves, that we are faithful and righteous and good before God. But it's not for our own glory. It's to give God the glory. Sometimes we fail to make the right decision. What's the result? What if Daniel had never stood up and said no? What if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had just sort of pretended? You see, through the course of history, that this kingdom and the kingdom that came after it led to God's people returning to rebuild Jerusalem, and for God's people to rising up, and that Jesus Christ being born in Bethlehem. Would God's will have been done regardless? Absolutely. Absolutely, God's way would have been done. But look at the result. A world leader Imagine a world leader today. If we were faced with this, if we knew what was going to happen, would we make the same decision? I think so. I think so. We don't have the luxury of knowing that, though. We've got to make these decisions on a daily basis. Sometimes a moment-to-moment basis that I'm going to obey regardless of what any kind of consequence might come to me because of who I am as a Christian. I'm going to do what's right, not what's easy. And we might not come out of the fire. We might not. We might have to live our life in the fire. Knowing, though, that one day we will be rewarded in heaven. Are you making those right decisions? There's only a right way to live, and that's God's way. If you want to be a part of His church, the kingdom that Nebuchadnezzar declares is going to last forever, you can be added to it through baptism this morning and wash away your sins. Won't you come as we stand and sing?